Freire. Okay, in this idea of false generosity is a similar idea known as false charity. So we have false generosity and we have false charity. And the question is, what's false charity? False charity is an attempt to seek increase the viability of charity by reinforcing the dehumanization of those seeking charity. What does that mean? If it's the case that I am a member of the oppressed group, and we'll just say I'm homeless, right? And I am the oppressor. This is just an example, right? The claim is an attempt to increase the viability of charity, right? Increase the viability of charity by reinforcing the dehumanization of the other. No one does this better. Nobody has done this better. And it's a very technical account in Freire. No one, and this is the genius. This is why Dave Chappelle, if you're watching my video right now, please come back on the air, right? This is why Dave Chappelle was a genius, right? Chappelle has a skit where there's a young boy and he's walking with his mom, and there's a homeless person on the street asking for money. And I think the mom might have, thrown some change at the homeless person, right? And the kid grows up, and the kid walks and he sees a homeless person. The homeless person's like, hey, can I have something, right? And he talks, Freire, I'm not sure if I have it in my lecture, but he talks about sort of the hands being stretched out, the hands coming back, blah, blah, blah. But the homeless person has his hand stretched out for a donation, right? For a gift. And what the kid does in the skit, he's like, why don't you go get a job, right? And this was based on pedagogy too. So I don't know. Chappelle might have known this, right? In Sesame Street, there's a character of the Grouch. And what he's saying, what Chappelle did in the skit, was to show that the character of the Grouch influenced the kid to become grouchy, right? But the Grouch in Sesame Street is specifically a pedagogical device, right? That's the whole point of Sesame Street, is pedagogy, right? It's pedagogy on acid, if you will. It's like happy-go-lucky, entertaining pedagogy. But what ended up happening is the kid learned from the Grouch that we don't really care about these other people, and it's like, go get a job, right? You bum, or something like that. That's what is being stated here. This false charity only gives insofar as, if I'm going to give you a gift, you have to recognize, insofar as you receive this gift, that you also accept and receive your continued oppression. If you think that I'm going to give you a gift for the purpose of motivating your liberation, well then you're not going to get the gift, right? So that if you think about this, the gift, the giving, becomes conditional, right? And according to Freire, if the gift is conditioned on the maintenance of this imbalance in power, then it's a false charity, right? It's not true charity, right? That's not what charity is. Charity in its realist sense is just the opposite, and in a couple seconds I'll talk about what that is. Okay. So, we know what false generosity is, we know what false charity is. The next thing that he discusses is true generosity. And in true generosity, I was going to say Chappelle, Freire says that true generosity is only meaningful insofar as liberation is directed to overthrow dehumanization and injustice, right? Real generosity is only meaningful insofar as it is an understanding that this act of generosity is to bring a group of oppressed people, bring sort of a cohort of oppressed groups out of their oppression, right? This oscillation back towards humanization. To be technical, it is the act of humanization. So to be very technical then, the only way we can talk about true generosity is within the context of humanization. The only way that we can have an understanding of false generosity is in an attempt to reinforce dehumanization, right? So it's not the appearance of humanization, it's real humanization in true generosity. True generosity seeks to diminish the conditions wherein charity is viable, right? If charity has viability within the community, right? Meaning, like for example, here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where I live, I don't know the name of the group, but there are homeless people sort of strategically set on, like at an intersection, at like all 4 points of a major intersection, and they're wearing like very bright, like almost glow in the dark fluorescent vests. They're allowed by the city to beg for money, and you can give them money. And I asked one of the homeless people one day, because I typically give, but I was curious. So I asked the homeless person, I was like, I noticed that all of you they have this weird little container that they put all the money in, and all of them use the same container. So I asked the homeless guy, I was like, well, what happens to this money? I mean, are you keeping this money? Do you give this money to someone else? And I think if I remember correctly, he said, yeah, we get to keep 60% of the money, but 40% has to go back to the institution, the organization that sort of provides us bedding and clothing and blah, blah, blah. Not even clothing, I think it's just shelter. To no surprise, obviously, there was a big scam a few years ago where that money was obviously being misused, right? For a profit, for an individual's profit, right? That system in which our charity is used to reinforce their poverty, right? Think about that. Our charity is used to reinforce their poverty because they have to go out and beg the next day, really isn't charity, right? True generosity, true charity is the construction of a system wherein the viability of charity loses its power. Charity is no longer viable, right? So what in the world does that mean? I'll just talk in terms of an adage, right? The old adage is, I can go fishing, I forget how it goes, but it's something like, I can go fishing and give you a fish, right? Which would be an act of charity. And to be technical, me going fishing and giving you a fish if you're hungry is an act of false charity, whereas an act of real generosity, an act of true generosity is to take you to the stream with me and show you how to fish. Insofar as I've shown you how to fish, I have negated the viability of charity. Charity is no longer viable because you no longer have to ask me for fish when you're hungry. You can go and feed yourself, right? So that's what he's saying, right? It's less about me giving you a fish and more about me teaching you how to fish. I guess that's the best way to explain this concept, right? And this is only attained by the efforts of the oppressed. The oppressed group has to recognize their oppression and attempt to find the mechanisms in which they can liberate themselves from their oppression. And we're talking strategically about, and I hate to use sort of organizational language, lingo, but a skill set, right? We need a skill set, right? A functional skill set, in a sense, right? I like to keep it international and conceptual, but I think that will work. Okay, so next are the insights of the oppressed, right? The insights of the oppressed. There's an awareness of an oppressive society, right? The oppressed group has to be aware that there is an oppressive society, right? That the very fabric in which they exist is itself oppressive. There's a first-hand experience of suffering. Now this is very important, right? The inside of the oppressed group is of suffering, right? It doesn't seem like that would be something that could be used to your advantage as an oppressed group, but the fact that you are suffering as an oppressed group is actually, I don't want to say the suffering is itself advantageous. Freire is not saying that the suffering is itself advantageous, but my understanding of the mechanisms in which I am suffering is advantageous. So, during the Civil Rights era, I recognized, insofar as I was living in the 50s and in the 60s, that I'm suffering insofar as I go on a bus and I'm forced to sit in the back of the bus. And if, the back of the bus is full, I have to wait for the next bus to sit on the back of the bus, despite the fact that there might be open seats in the front. I recognize the system of my oppression, the system of my suffering, the bus system, the transportation system. And what I did is I attacked the system, the structure. Because in a sense, the system, not in a sense, in a very real sense, the system is only functional insofar as it serves me. So I'm going to boycott the bus, right? And what ends up happening? You recognize sort of economic might, the economic power of the oppressed group, something that you didn't want to recognize, and the system comes to a crash. And obviously the system changed. The system didn't change because, to be honest with you, right, I'm very pessimistic, so forgive me, but I don't believe the system changed because there was necessarily at that moment a recognition of one's humanity, but there was a recognition of one's economic ability, right? Freire is not talking about a recognition of economic might, right? What he's talking about is a genuine recognition of one's of an oppressed group's worth as human beings, not just because you have money. Anytime we talk about sort of boycotting in this generation, anytime we talk about economic transformation or revolution, it's almost always inherently discussed in terms of economics. Freire is not concerned with that. He's talking about the recognition of one's worth as an individual, right? Almost in a Kantian sense, right? Also an understanding of the importance of liberation. Okay.